You're 22 years old. You have 2,000 followers, but you feel completely alone. You're in 5 group chats, but nobody actually knows you. You check your phone 150 times a day, but still feel disconnected. That's not a coincidence. That's not you being broken. That's Gen Z. I'm talking about people born between 1997 and 2012. And before you write them off as just the TikTok generation, stay with me, because this gets darker than you probably realize. Gen Z became the first generation to never know a world without the internet. The iPhone launched in 2007, which means the oldest Gen Zers were 10 when smartphones became normal, and the youngest were literally born into a world where screens were babysitters. That's not just a tech difference. That's a fundamental rewiring of human development. Psychologist Dr. Jean Twenge, who's been tracking generational mental health for decades, found something alarming. Gen Z reports the highest rates of anxiety and depression of any generation on record. We're not talking about a small bump. We're talking about a 70% increase in mental health issues compared to millennials at the same age. An entire demographic walking around with their stress hormones in permanent overdrive. But here's where your brain should pay attention, because this goes way deeper than phones are bad. Gen Z didn't just get social media. They got it during the most psychologically vulnerable years of their lives. Middle school and high school, when your brain is literally reorganizing itself and figuring out who you are. Except instead of figuring that out through trial and error with friends, they figured it out while performing for an algorithm that rewards extremes and punishes authenticity. The psychological term for this is continuous social comparison syndrome. Your sense of self isn't forming through real experiences anymore. It's forming through metrics, likes, views, engagement, follower counts. And here's the part that'll mess with you. Research from the University of Pennsylvania shows that even knowing social media is bad for you doesn't stop it from affecting you. Your brain can't tell the difference between real social rejection and getting fewer likes than you expected. The cortisol spike is identical. Think about the actual timeline for a second. Gen Z's formative years, the ages when you're supposed to be learning how to navigate the world, coincided with the 2008 financial crisis, which they watched destroy their parents' security. School shootings becoming so normalized they had active shooter drills like fire drills, and a 24/7 news cycle designed to maximize fear because fear keeps you scrolling. They didn't just inherit anxiety. They were raised in an environment specifically designed to create it. And let's talk about what happened during their most crucial developmental years. The pandemic. The oldest Gen Zers were in college. The youngest were in elementary school. But the middle group, the teenagers, they lost what developmental psychologists call crucial socialization windows. You're supposed to learn how to exist in the world by being in the world. Making mistakes in real time, reading body language, navigating uncomfortable situations face to face. Gen Z got Zoom school instead. Their brains were wiring for adulthood during a period when being an adult meant isolation, uncertainty, and watching the people in charge completely fail to handle a crisis. The long-term psychological impact of that is still being studied, but early research isn't encouraging. A study in JAMA Pediatrics found that depression and anxiety symptoms doubled in adolescents during 2020 to 2021. And unlike a temporary spike, those numbers haven't gone back down. And before you think, maybe they're just too sensitive, or maybe something's wrong with them, stop. This isn't a flaw. This is their brains responding exactly how they should when the world they were promised doesn't match the world they got. Now here's something that might make you uncomfortable. Gen Z is simultaneously the most connected generation in human history and the loneliest. A survey by Cigna found that Gen Z reports higher loneliness scores than any other age group. They have thousands of followers but feel like nobody actually knows them. They're in group chats with dozens of people but still feel isolated. This is what psychologists call parasocial exhaustion. You're maintaining the performance of connection without getting the actual psychological benefits that come from real, messy, in-person relationships. Your brain knows something's off, but it can't quite pinpoint what, so it just stays in this low-level state of unease. And the performance pressure is unrelenting. Gen Z doesn't just have to succeed in school and eventually at work. They also have to build a personal brand, maintain a social media presence, stay politically informed, have the right opinions, document their lives, and do it all while looking effortless. Previous generations had to perform competence in maybe one or two arenas. Gen Z has to perform it everywhere, all the time, for an audience that never stops watching. But let me throw something at you that cuts even deeper. Gen Z was told they could change the world, that their voices matter, that they're empowered like never before. And in some ways, that's true. They've organized movements, shifted cultural conversations, held institutions accountable in ways that seemed impossible before. Except here's the psychological trap. They're also inheriting a world that's objectively worse in measurable ways. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's their lived reality. The job market isn't just competitive, it's fundamentally unstable. Housing isn't just expensive, it's borderline impossible without generational wealth. College isn't just costly, it's potentially financially ruinous. So you've got a generation that's been told they're powerful while simultaneously being handed a series of crises they didn't create and realistically can't fix. That's not empowerment. That's learned helplessness with a motivational Instagram caption. The economic anxiety is real. Millennials graduated into a recession. Gen Z is graduating into what economists call perma-crisis, where instability is the permanent condition. They're not waiting for things to get better. They're adapting to the assumption that they won't, which explains why Gen Z approaches work differently. They don't believe in corporate loyalty because they've watched it fail their parents. They're not lazy, they're responding rationally to an irrational system. Gen Z grew up where everyone has a platform, and distinguishing fact from fiction requires constant vigilance. Deepfakes, misinformation, entire narratives collapsing in real time. Researchers call this epistemic uncertainty, a baseline distrust of information itself. But here's what nobody talks about. Gen Z is also more inclusive, more aware, more willing to challenge systems of oppression than any previous generation. They demand accountability and refuse to accept that's just how things are. That's not entitlement. That's pattern recognition. Gen Z didn't invent skepticism toward authority. They just have more evidence it's justified. The mental health conversation is completely different for Gen Z. They talk about therapy like it's normal, discuss anxiety openly. That destigmatization is revolutionary, except they're doing it while living through conditions that are objectively more demanding. Gen Z gets criticized for being too sensitive, too fragile. You know what's interesting? That criticism usually comes from people who didn't grow up with their mistakes documented forever, who didn't have to perform for an algorithm. Gen Z isn't more fragile. They're more aware of the systems that cause harm and refuse to pretend they're fine. That's not weakness. That's clarity. So what you've got is a generation shaped by constant connectivity and profound isolation, empowered messaging, and powerless reality, more information than ever, and less certainty about what's true. And society says, why are you so anxious? Why don't you buy a house? The psychology of Gen Z isn't complicated. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the world they were promised doesn't match the world they got. But here's what nobody's talking about. Gen Z is building something previous generations never could. Collective awareness that the system is broken. Awareness is the first step to change. They're not waiting for permission. They're rewriting the rules. That's not fragility. That's evolution. They're not broken. They're adapting. And the fact that they're still trying, still organizing, still demanding better, that's resilience under conditions previous generations never had to endure. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate it.